Last week, or do you just carry on? Okay. You got his birthday down?
No.
No, not yet.
No.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll look at Muhammad's wives and his family then a little bit. So if you remember from last week then, he got married when he was 25, and his wife, he married someone called Khadija, who was his boss. And she was the businesswoman and owner of a sort of trading company with caravans, camels, taking stuff around the place. And he was a very good manager and known to be very honest. And then she proposed to him. He didn't propose to her, she proposed to him, and they married. And they're very happily married. And Muhammad then only had one wife, Khadija, until after she died. And Khadija then is supposed to have had 4 daughters and 2 sons with him. The 2 sons died very, very young. And as far as the daughters are concerned, the Sunni believe all 4 daughters were her daughters, whereas the Shia, who was another sort of major branch of Islam, they think that only 1 daughter was from Muhammad and the other 3 were perhaps daughters she'd already had from a previous marriage, or maybe from uncles or aunts or something like that, adopted possibly. Anyway, don't know. No birth certificates in those days. And so that was before he left to Medina. So he's living in Mecca, and he had one wife, Khadija, and she loved and respected him very much and became his first follower. Then, as I mentioned last week, then she died, so it's a huge loss for Muhammad. At the same time, his uncle died, who was a source of political patronage and protection. And then he moved with his followers, 70 followers, to Medina. And just before then he moved, he married someone called Sauda. She was 55 years old, and she was a divorcee. And also got married to someone called Aisha, who was only 6 years old at the time. So although he got betrothed to her, then she's carried on living with her father's family until she is 9 or 10 years old. So when she's about 10, then they consummated their marriage. And so Aisha was so all the people that he married apart from Aisha, they were all either previously divorced or widowed. And so 3 of her daughters, Khadija's daughters, they went on to marry caliphs. These are rulers that came after Muhammad. And all his wives are called mothers of the believers. So the reasons for marrying, well, as I said, a lot of the people he married were either widows or divorced. So sometimes this would be to help out the widows of his companions. So there may have been a very close friend of his who fought in a war, a battle, was killed in the battle, and when she became widowed, then there'd be nobody to take care of her and her children. So sometimes he married the widows of his companions. What's another reason for his marriages? So he got married, eventually had 10 wives, and sometimes it's to create family bonds between him and his companions. So he married the daughters of Abu Bakr, who was one of his closest followers, and Umar. And then Uthman and Ali, again 2 of his closest followers, they married his daughters. So he had family then, bonds with all the first 4 caliphs. So the caliphs were the rulers that came after him. They were called caliphs. So it's all very, very close within the family. And also through these kind of marriages, he spread the message, because it's a way of uniting the different clans through marriage. So these are different reasons for getting married. And all his wives are called mothers of the believers. So after he died, then they talk about the sort of sayings. Aisha was particularly prominent in this, in that she memorized lots of the things that he said. They're called hadith, we'll look at later. And she passed on a lot of the family traditions and the stories about him. One of the ladies he married, Safiya, she was the wife and daughter of a very prominent, of the leader of a Jewish tribe in Medina, and then after her father and her husband had both been killed by Muhammad, then he married her, and then she converted to Islam. Sorry?
He was killed by Muhammad.
Yes, well there's a time, I'm not quite sure if I'm come to that later, but anyway, there was a time when Muhammad went to Medina, there were 4 Arab tribes there and 2 Jewish tribes, and they'd been fighting. Originally there were just Jewish tribes living there, but then I think they went there in about the 2nd century after Christ, and then later on 4 Arab tribes moved there from Yemen, and there was a lot of squabbling between them, you know, who's going to be in charge, and Arab tribes trying to dominate the Jewish tribes. And so there are about 4 sort of battles within this town between these different tribes. And so one of the main reasons why they invited Muhammad to go to Medina, because he was known to be a person who was just and fair, and they wanted him to go to Medina to resolve the disputes amongst the different tribes. So he'd be like the sort of the lawgiver, the judge, the person who would, who could be trusted to resolve disputes. Anyway, at one point then, so after, I was going to talk about this later, but anyway, when he went there, he established what's called the Constitution of Medina, where certain rules about how all the tribes should interact with each other, and each was allowed to, carry on practicing their own religion. So the Arab tribes are mostly pagans. Then the Muslims went there, so that was another element, his followers, and then there was the Jewish tribes. So each of them could carry on worshipping God, practicing their own faith, but that beyond that, they were all part of the same community, living in Medina, and so they had to fight together against a common enemy. And so it appears that twice, on 2 occasions, something happened with the Jewish tribes, and then as far as I remember, once they wouldn't go out to fight, and then they got punished for that. Another time they did something else, and so as a result of that, then the leader of one of the Jewish tribes was executed, and who was the father of Safiya, and also her husband as well. So she didn't like Muhammad very much. Well, she's a very prominent person, and so he proposed to her marriage. And after a while, she decided he was actually a very nice person, and then she married him and converted to Islam. So why did he marry her? Well, she's a very prominent person. It wasn't really he wasn't becoming, I suppose you could say, for someone who was of that social status to end up becoming a slave. And also maybe it's like often seen perhaps as an act of reconciliation, that it wasn't, anti-Jewish in that sense. So there are different ways in which, one can interpret this.
Does it detail any, like, his relationship with the different wives? I mean, although he had 10 wives, what are the boundaries?
What were the boundaries?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Like,
Well, they all used to have their own little house, and he would visit them on rotation, spend equal amount of time, equal number of nights with them. The oldest was the first one, I think, and he didn't have. I don't know why, but apparently he didn't appear to have had any children with these other wives. Why, I don't know. The only children he had with his first wife, Khadija. And as I said, within the Arab world, it was incredibly important to get married to a virgin, and people didn't marry women who weren't virgins. So normally, someone who is divorced or widowed, they'll be out there having to sort of try and manage by themselves. And so it's often seen that Muhammad just married people who either divorced or widowed. It's like an act of compassion. It wasn't the sort of thing that would normally go on.
So to be protected because
It's-
society was not very safe. In
Yes, it's often seen as a mixture of things. One, it's a way of taking care, compassion, taking care of the wives of his friends who perished in battle, and at the same time taking care of their children and supporting their families who otherwise wouldn't be supported.
But they didn't need to become his wives.
Sorry, they didn't need to become his wives.
No, he protected them.
Well, anyway, that's just
So they would have been like slave or wife or slave.
Well, I mean, all I can say is that's what happened. I mean, I don't know what the options were. Generally speaking, I don't know if they had a sort of that kind of thing where he would look after them but wouldn't marry them. I don't know if that kind of. A lot of these things are sort of social institutions, and whether that kind of institution existed or that kind of relationship would have, I don't know. I mean, it's just the way it was.
Quite a few mother-in-laws then.
I suppose he did. I mean, it's probably more difficult looking out, keeping the mother-in-laws happier than. But anyway, apparently they all, loved him and said nice things about him, and they're all called the mothers of the believers. Well, not believers, but believers. Not a spelling mistake there. And Muhammad was a very interesting person. He did the housework. I mean, maybe that's the way he thought. Well, to keep my wives happy. Anyway, he did housework. He was a very down-to-earth person. He had lots of conversations with his wives, and it's those conversations which his wives passed on and told that became the basis of the story. So he treated them with a lot of respect and treated them as more or less as equals. On the other hand, he wouldn't allow them to go around claiming special treatment because they were his wives. So that, within society, they were just ordinary women. They couldn't say, well, I'm Muhammad's wife, therefore I need you need to give me an extra pair of shoes or something, or whatever. So it's interesting. And his wives played a very important role within Islam, and afterwards they were very much involved, often in politics in the early days of Islam, and also in passing on the hadith. Aisha herself was extremely well educated and played a very prominent role in his Muslim life after Muhammad himself passed away. So basically, as I said, he was. How can I make this go forwards? I've lost my cursor. I can't find my. Oh, there it is. Found it. Okay. Okay, let's have a look a little bit at Muhammad's legacy. So he went through a lot of changes in roles. So he started off as a rebel in Mecca, preaching this revolutionary idea that there is only one God, you shouldn't worship idols, and you shouldn't be involved in corruption, etc., etc., etc. And his teaching about the status of women was totally revolutionary. And so he was persecuted a lot, we looked at last week, was nearly killed, and basically was like that. But then, as I said just now, he was invited to go to Medina, and in Medina he had the role of being a statesman. And so as a change of role, and as a statesman then he became the ruler of Medina and transformed Medina. And in terms of his legacy, as well as the Quran, which we talked about last week, was like a sort of extraordinary revelation, like a miracle, the language. He also hugely improved the position of women. In reality, hugely improved the position of women. So, for example, though still till today there's polygamy in many Muslim societies, in reality he improved their situation within the Arab world hugely compared to the situation of women before the time of Islam, which is very, very miserable, and they're really very mistreated. And you still see this sort of cultural legacy even till today, but it's much worse at the time of Muhammad. So through the way he himself treated women, Khadija, his wife, and his other wives, he elevated the status of women. And so in Muslim society then, Islamic society, women are allowed to own property from that time. So if they were widowed, they kept the property, and they could inherit property. So when were women allowed to own property in Europe? From when? What?
1800s?
Yes, middle of the 19th century. Up until then, if you're a wealthy woman and you got married, all your property was transferred and became your husband's property. That wasn't the case in Islam. In Islam, if you got married, the property still belonged to you. It wasn't a transfer of ownership to your husband. So in many ways, status of women was, in theory, the status of women in Islam is very, very high, and much better kind of practically and theoretically than it is within the European Christian world up until recently. Yeah. And so that's why quite a lot of women in Britain and other places, they convert to Islam because they want to have all these rights. So for example, a Muslim woman, if she works, she can keep all the money herself that she earns. It's actually the responsibility and the duty of a husband to support his wife and his family and his children. And the wife, if she has a job and earns some money, she doesn't have to contribute that towards the family budget. That's purely her own personal money. So there's lots of these very interesting rules, which, but as I said, that's in theory. But, in a lot of Muslim countries, the cultural reality lags a long way behind the theoretical position that women should have. So lots of things, we talk about Islam oppressing women. That's not from the theory of Islam, that's just the cultural legacy, because it's very hard for cultures to change. So Islam then came along and tried to change a lot of these cultural traditions. Some were changed, but many, many weren't changed. They remain very oppressive. He also brought justice. So Islamic law is very fair and just. Again, especially compared to what was before. So before there was just a lot of feuding. There'd be different clans. If one person got killed by somebody from another clan, the only way that justice could be done, you go and kill one of them, and they'll come and kill one of you. And this feuding would go on for generations and generations. So Muhammad then, he put an end to the feuding, and so established a system of justice where people get punished not by, well, you killed one of us, so we're going to kill one of you, but the murderer would be the one who would be punished. So it was different, set up a system of justice. He also condemned infanticide. So again, lots of, sort of predisposition to thinking that men are more valuable, and so often daughters would be killed at birth. So again, Islam put an end to infanticide. Even though still, we read the newspapers, still some of this sort of thing goes on. Improve the status of slaves hugely. So slaves also had rights. But still, even till today, slavery is still regarded as a legal condition within Islam. So within the Islamic world, there is still slavery, and slavery within Islam is still condoned. But the situation of slaves in Islam after Muhammad was much better than the status of slaves before. So Muslims can't become slaves. So where would Muslims get slaves from then? Muslims couldn't be enslaved. Then where would they get their slaves?
Why not?
Sorry? What? No, they used to get them from Europe. White Christians could be enslaved. So, up until 150 years ago, maybe even less. They were called the Barbary pirates from North Africa. They used to come along and they used to attack villages in Cornwall and take people off into slavery.
Yeah,
Till?
that.
Hmm.
Men, women, and children, everybody.
Yeah, they were just, these ships would arrive in this Cornish or village or Devon or somewhere, probably in Brittany as well. Anyway, just arrive and go and, cart people off and take people back to North Africa or somewhere else and make them slaves, because Muslims themselves couldn't be enslaved. So, if you want slaves, you obviously have to go and invade a Christian country.
In Africa.
Sorry?
In Africa.
Well, anywhere, and enslave people. So yeah, so that's a real issue. That, as I said, within Islam, until today, slavery is still a legal, legally allowed. Okay, restricted polygamy. And so again, within Islam, it allows men are allowed to have up to 4 wives. Up until before then, could have an unlimited number of wives. So there's a huge restriction on that. But also certain conditions that go along with it. One is that you have to love all your wives equally. Muhammad said, if you're going to have more than one wife, you have to make sure you love them all equally so they don't feel jealous. Is that easy? And you're supposed to ask permission from your wives, can I marry another one? And then there are very practical reasons for polygamy then. So within that part of the world, people, there'd be a lot of fighting going on. And the people who do the fighting would be the men. And so when people get killed, or the men gets killed, well, what happens to their wives? And so it was regarded as an act of compassion that widows should be married, get married to. So that's why you'd have polygamy, because you generally have more men than there were women, because a lot of the men got killed fighting. And then, of course, if you're an unmarried woman and there's nobody to get married to, you can't have children. There's nobody's, you're in a situation where no one's going to take care of you. So again, it was regarded as an act of compassion that every woman had a right to get married and to have children. And if there weren't enough men to go around, then the logical thing to do would be for men to have more than one wife. So these are the kind of conditions. Of course, these things are abused. But, when you think about the reality, the social reality of the time, you can understand, okay, what were the alternatives? That widows should be unlooked after and uncared for, or that some women would never have the chance to marry. And of course, you get men getting killed, then you need to replenish the supply of men. And so it's women that have babies. And so, just the way it worked. So then Muhammad also introduced this idea of the Ummah. So the Ummah is the Muslim community, although in that time Medina, the Ummah also included these 2 Jewish tribes. But nowadays, the Ummah is regarded as all Muslims. It's like the community of Muslims. Like the church is a community of Christians, and the Ummah then is the community of Muslims. And it would be something which would transcend tribal loyalties. So up until then, people's primary source of loyalty was to the tribe. So Muhammad said, no, the primary source of loyalty is not to the tribe, but to the Ummah, this wider community. And trying to transcend the tribal loyalties and tribal identities. And so that continues up until today. So Muslims then, even though whatever country they're born in, generally speaking, many have a primary sense of loyalty to the Ummah, not to the country to which they're born, like their nationality. So there's a sense of Islam transcending nationality and transcending your nation or your race or your tribe or anything else. It's a primary source of community. And so practically speaking, Muhammad was able to unite these Arab tribes, which were always fighting against each other. And they converted to Islam. And then with that, they adopted Islamic values and virtues over time. And so this transformed Arabia. And in doing that, it led to the transformation of the world. Because having all these Arab tribes having united together and also having adopted Islam, they became incredibly powerful and disciplined, and then they invaded the rest of the Middle East and North Africa and to Spain and everywhere else. And that became the base. The Quran means recitation. Okay, so if you remember last week, the angel appeared to Muhammad and said recite or read. And so Muslims then, they recite the Quran. And this was, it's believed that it's dictated to Muhammad by Jibril or Gabriel, and he received all the words and sentences and the verses of the Quran, which are in poetry. The Quran itself is a book which is divided up into chapters, which are called surahs, and then there are also verses called ayahs, I think. Can't remember now. Have a look down here somewhere. Yeah, ayahs. Verses are called ayahs. And so the Quran then, it was received by Muhammad in Arabic, and it's all extraordinarily beautiful because it's poetry. And so Muslims then say that any translation of the Quran isn't the Quran. The Quran itself cannot be translated, because every time it's translated, it's interpreted. And of course you lose the rhythm of you lose the meaning, but also you lose the poetry as well that goes along with it. So the longest, anyway, so the way, it's a very difficult book to read, because it's not organized chronologically as a story. It's not organized in terms of a logical table of contents. It's organized in terms of the chapters, the longest chapters first and the shortest chapters last. Okay, that's how it's organized. And then the shortest chapters, generally speaking, were the earliest chapters, the ones that he received in Mecca. Okay, and then the longer chapters were the ones he received later. They're generally speaking the ones he received in Medina. And so it's not like it's not like the Bible. You start off in Genesis and it's a story which goes all the way through Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, the Judges, the Kings, the Prophets, etc., and the life of Jesus in the Bible. It's not like that. And so there are different ways of studying the Quran. If you just read it from beginning to end, it's kind of hard to understand what's going on. So one way to do it is two best ways to do it really are to try and understand each revelation that Muhammad received was given to Muhammad in a particular context, at a particular moment in his life, to address a particular situation. So for example, there are various verses or chapters about Jews. So those particular passages were given to Muhammad in Revelation at the time when they're having this conflict with Jewish tribes. And particular verses about his wife Aisha, for example, were given because of a certain situation with Aisha. And so you read it and you think, well, what's that about? So one way to read it is to read the Quran along with a sort of biography of Muhammad. You read the biography and you say, okay, that's when he received this particular revelation. Then you look at that part in the Quran, and then you can understand the historical context when these particular passages were revealed to him, and then they're much more meaningful in context. That's one way to do it. Another way is to use a table of contents, and if you want to know what does the Quran say about this topic, and then you'll look up the word in the table of contents, and you'll see different references in different pages, and you can look it up like that. Because again, so another way you can read it. If you want to know what it says about Jesus, again, the references are scattered around in the Quran. Or what you want to know about Mary or a particular prophet or particular thing, these references are often quite scattered because, In terms of the content, there's all sorts of things. There's laws, there's stories, there's sayings. Some of it is very specifically addressed to a particular content, text at that particular moment of his life. It assumes a knowledge of the Bible, especially, it assumes a knowledge of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it refers to Noah, for example, but it hasn't got the whole story of Noah. It just has a few bits. Because the people that Muhammad was talking to, often as I said, there were Jewish tribes living there. Quite a few of these Jews, they converted to Islam. There were also Christians who were living there, some of the Arab tribes, there were Christians amongst the Arabs, and they also converted to Islam because they saw Muhammad as a prophet. And so when they read the Quran, they read it with this prior knowledge of the biblical stories. And so it doesn't repeat these biblical stories, it refers to the people, and sometimes it might have an interesting extra piece of information about these stories, which is quite interesting actually. Especially, for example, about Abraham, for example, quite a few things about Abraham and Ishmael and Hagar. So in the Bible it says Abraham kicked Hagar and Ishmael out, and they went off into the desert, and you might wonder, well, what happened to them? Well, you pick up the story in the Quran, because the Quran picks up the story of Ishmael and Hagar, and oh, that's what happened. So the first time I started reading the Quran, I thought, oh, this is like some of the missing chapters from the Bible. It's like you watch a soap opera and you wonder what happened. Because the story's not finished in the Bible, but some of these stories are completed in the Quran, or little extra details you find in the Quran. So it's quite interesting, from that point of view, looking at reading the Quran as, what does it say about Noah? What does it say about Abraham? What does it say about these particular prophetic characters whose stories you already know? And then again, it's another way of getting into the Quran. Ideally one should learn the Arabic and be able to understand it and read in Arabic, but it's not everybody's going to go there. Chris?
Did Muhammad know much about the Old Testament or the Torah in his life?
Well, I don't know. The Muslim position is that everything he received came by revelation, that it didn't come from any prior knowledge. He certainly was unable to read, he was illiterate. But there again, he was a searcher, so I can imagine he would have met, Jews, and Mecca itself was the center of a religious center with all these idols and the Kaaba. So I can imagine somebody like Muhammad probably would have had an interest in what do you believe and what do you believe, and talking to all the pilgrims that were coming there. So I can imagine it's quite possible he might have picked up a lot of these stories. And then when Jews read the Quran, they say, well, actually a lot of these passages, these extra bits of the story you don't find in the Bible, you can actually find in the Talmud. So they would say, well, that was something going on in the oral tradition amongst Jews, and he picked it up and put it down. But there again, the poetry is perfect. So how does it work? I don't know. And also some of the extra stories about Jesus, which you don't find in the New Testament, you also find in other Christian books which never made it into the New Testament. We have the four Gospels, but actually lots of other Christian writings that were rejected by the Catholic Church because they weren't regarded as being early enough, basically. The four Gospels are basically from the 1st century, but there are lots of other Gospels which came in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And again, so quite a bit of the material you find in the Quran about Jesus, you could also find analogues in these other non-biblical Christian writings. So I don't know. Anyway, I'd say that Muslims believe it came directly from Gabriel's revelation, and that he didn't pick it up from anywhere else. And as I said, it's all in poetry, and so Muhammad received it, he memorized it, and then he recited it to his followers, and they also learnt it off by heart. And also they'd write it down. So some passages from the Quran written down on, you get some bones, for example. Which bone, who's into anatomy here? No, some bones, they have quite a shoulder bone, I think, has quite a large flat surface, isn't it? So there'd be, often these sorts of things would be used. They didn't have paper in those days, and, animal skins are very expensive. So they wrote these things down on strips of wood or bark, on bits of animal bone, and they were written down. And then later, after Muhammad died, then they were all assembled and put down. So Muslims then, they claim that the Quran, the book as it is today, is exactly as it was received by Muhammad. In reality, scholars say there were variants, texts, variations, but then one of the caliphs, he didn't like the fact that there were different variant readings, so he collected them all together and just issued a standard version, which is the one which is still used until today. And so Muslims then, as I said last week, they believe this is perfect, revelation. It hasn't been corrupted, it hasn't been distorted, it hasn't been changed. Unlike the Torah, which was given to Moses, or the gospel given to Jesus. And it's called the Noble Quran because the quality of the Arabic has never been exceeded. Nobody's ever written better Arabic than you can find in the Quran. So in many ways, it's the Quran then is the basis really of not just of Islam but of Arabic culture, because there's nothing comparable. It's like the founding document or founding text of the whole of Arabic culture. Before then there was some poems, but there's nothing written down. Whereas that's different, when you think about what are the founding texts of European culture. Well, obviously the Bible is one of them, but also got all the Greek philosophers. It's the same for Judaism. You have the Bible, the Torah, but also there's another whole range of other things as well. So there's nothing... Yes, so if you're an Arab and you don't read the Quran, it's very difficult, because that's the foundation of your whole literary culture and spiritual culture. That makes sense? Unlike you can be English and you can get by without ever reading the Bible, because there's lots of other literature around. So it has that particular status within Arabic and Muslim culture.
But since the Quran was written, there have been other historical
Yes,
documents written in Arabic.
yes, but none of them of comparable literary quality to the Quran, in terms of the quality of the language, the quality of the literature, the quality of the poetry. It stands head and shoulders above anything else which has come along since. That's what they say.
Just wanted to ask, when you received originally he was told to read, despite the fact he did not know. Was it written immediately after that on something or what?
Well, he received the first time, he received Revelation when he was 40 years old, and he just memorized it. He couldn't write.
I could memorize it.
He could memorize it. He learnt it off by heart.
Yeah.
So in cultures which are not literate, it's very common for people to memorize long poems and poetry and whole lists of genealogies and things. It's quite common. And the bards would recite it, and the whole community would listen. And if the next bard got it wrong, everyone would correct him. So in that sense, it's like something, not one individual who memorizes these things. It's like knowledge which is in the mind of the whole community. And if somebody tries to change it, then people say, why are you changing it? Why aren't you saying it the way it was said? So actually oral tradition is much more reliable. It's not like Chinese whispers, actually, not like that at all. And so Muslims say, today if every single Quran in the world were burnt, they could, the next day they completely recreate it exactly the way that it is, because so many people have memorized it. And so that's the way it was. And, the Bible, before it was written down, these stories were passed on, and they were told, and they were retold, and people would memorize them. Because people in those days were used to memorizing. I mean, I'm sure, Hugo, when you were at school, you had to memorize poetry.
Yes.
Yeah, now it's called child abuse, but yes. And you still remember some poems, I would imagine. Maybe. Anyway, I remember when I was in Russia, I went to Russia, lived there for many years, and people would just sit around reciting poetry together and singing songs which they'd all learnt 40, 50 years before at school. They'd all learnt the same poetry from Pushkin and all these other poets. And they would just sit around the dining room table just reciting poems to each other and together. And it was very much an oral culture. Obviously very literate as well, but you could see how easy it was for all these, and you just sit around, you listen to these poems when you're a child, and you just absorb them, and then you can recite them yourself. And it's very easy then for these sort of things to be passed unchanged through generations. So oral tradition is much more reliable than people think it is, actually. that the way it was in Scotland?
Well, I memorised Tam Shanter, which is about
Yeah.
15 minutes.
But that's the way it was, but that's the way it was historically in Scotland, wasn't it, in the Highlands before they became literate.
I think so.
They were just,
It was a very long narrative poem, but actually Burns was only going to write 2 lines for a magazine to advertise some church.
Yeah.
And he made it his longest poem.
Uh-huh.
It's fun learning.
Yeah.
It's very good for the men.
He got well paid for his advertising copy.
Yeah. I think so.
Okay, so you have these people called Hafiz. So it's quite common for Muslims to, when they're young, obviously, just to memorize the whole Quran. The Quran's not like the Bible, which is incredibly thick. It's actually relatively slim. But also because it's poetry, it's much easier to memorize poetry than to memorize prose. And so lots of Muslim young people, they set themselves this challenge to memorize the Quran. And then reciting the Quran, even if you can't understand it, it's like a spiritual experience. Because of the rhythm of the poetry, it sort of vibrates the person's soul and their heart. And just reciting the Quran then is a way in which people their mind becomes filled with the Word of God and often can have some kind of spiritual, mystical experience. That's the kind of quality. And that's why a lot of people convert to Islam, is because of this experience of actually learning the Quran passages of the Quran off by heart, and then reciting it and feeling the poetry and the effect that it has upon their mind, their soul, their heart, and this spiritual kind of experience that goes along with it.
That's probably what happened to Cat Stevens.
Probably is.
Yeah, it was a real.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Okay, the practices, 5 pillars of Islam, which you probably heard about. So they've got these 5 pillars, and the foundation is the Quran of everything within Islam. So the foundation of the Quran, and the Ummah, that's like the spiritual community. So the spiritual community then is based upon the practice of these 5 pillars of faith, as they're often called. The 5 pillars of Islam, they're what support the community and mean the community exists. So without these 5 pillars, the community itself would disintegrate. That's a very important idea to try and see. So the first one is Shahada, that's a core belief, what Muslims believe. The second one, Salah, that's about prayer. Third one, Zakah, it's about tithing and charity. Fourth one is Sawm, that's about fasting. And the fifth one is Hajj, about pilgrimage. So Shahada, I can't say in Arabic, but this is what it's like in English. There is no God but Allah, or there is no God but God. In other words, there is only one God and God is one. And Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. This is what distinguishes them, I guess, from what distinguishes them from Christianity, from Islam. Because Christians and Jews also believe there's only one God, but they don't accept that Muhammad is a messenger or prophet of God. So that's what makes it different. And this on the right here, this is the Shahada in Arabic. And so the nature of the Arabic language is it's incredibly, what's the word? Anyway, you can do extraordinarily beautiful calligraphy with it, and you can read it. It's very, very beautiful. I don't know why, but anyway, that's what one can do. And so the Shahada then, to become a Muslim then, you have to recite this statement with a sincere heart. So if you recite this statement with a sincere heart in Arabic, then that's what it is to become a Muslim. A bit like a Christian, I suppose, reciting the Creed, which is obviously a lot more complicated. This is a very, very simple statement of faith. And this is the expansion of this, was the Adhan, or the call to prayer. And so this is when Muslims are called to prayer 5 times a day. And so when a Muslim baby is born, then this prayer is whispered into their ear. And then this is also the last utterance which a Muslim would hope to make before they die, just to say this prayer. A statement of faith, Shahada.
So when they have the call to prayer in the Muslim countries from the tower,
Yes.
Is it this? Or is it
Well, okay, it includes these two sentences, but it's also extended as well. Have you ever heard it?
Yeah.
It's beautiful, isn't it, to listen to? Extraordinarily beautiful. So it includes the Shahada, but also includes other statements. God is great, God is the greatest, Allah Akbar. It's very poetical. And various other things, such as, if it's a morning one, it says, better to sleep than to pray. No, better to pray than to sleep. Wake up, better to pray than to sleep. Okay, so Salah, this is prayer. So Muhammad said, if one of you had a river right by his door and he bathed in it 5 times a day, do you think there'd be any dirt left on him? They said, no, not a trace. He said, that is how it is with 5 prayers. By means of them, God washes away all sins. And so Muslims then, they pray compulsory prayers of 5 times a day. Of course, you can also do other extra voluntary prayers as well as that. And so the timing of these is established. You'd buy a book that tells you exactly what time you should be praying. And the first one, Fajr, is between dawn and sunrise. It's not when the sun rises, because they don't want to get mixed up with worshipping the sun. So it's in the sort of in-betweeny passage there. The second one is after midday. The third one is between late afternoon and sunset. So again, they don't work, it's not when the sun goes down, they don't want to mix it up with that. And then next one is between sunset and the end of the day. So it's in the sort of in-betweeny kind of times. And the last one is at night and before dawn. So it's quite manageable. When you wake up, before lunch, before afternoon tea, before supper, and before you go to sleep at night. Something like that. And so there's a preparation for prayer. So it's not just saying little prayers, quite a lot of preparation involved. So do something called wuzu. So first of all, they wash their hands. And so that's why you find a lot of water. You always find bathing areas at a mosque, and in Muslim countries, quite a few places, you find there are taps where people can wash for prayer. So they wash their hands and they rinse out their mouth 3 times. They sniff water into each nostril 3 times. They wash the face 3 times. Wash the right arm and then the left arm 3 times. Then they wipe their hair and the neck and the ears with wet hands. Then wash their right foot and then wash their left foot. And they're ready. Shahada. So this outward cleanliness symbolizes the inner purity of heart and soul necessary to enter into the presence of God who is holy. So the point of this on the outside is a way of getting the right intention. So through washing yourself, at the same time you're preparing your heart, preparing your mind, preparing your soul to enter into the presence of God. So just as, if you're going to go and see the Queen, you make sure you had an extra good bath and washed your ears and had a haircut and everything, put on your best clothes. So it's all, and in the dressing up, one is changing, one is preparing one's heart and soul. It's just like if you go to a party, part of the getting ready for the party is the dressing up, and in the dressing up, you're preparing your heart and getting into the right mentality or frame of mind to be doing something, yeah? That makes sense? The same, in England, when a judge wears a wig, before the judge goes and sits in judgment, he dresses up. And in the process of dressing up, he is preparing himself to sit in judgment and to put aside his own personal opinions and everything so he can judge fairly. So that's this outwards inner kind of thing, sung sang, hyung sang. One is an expression of the other. And in doing one, you are helping to do the other. So the prayer itself, Salah, so a Muslim will cover his head, so you can, so anyway, so you'll see they wear a little cap, and the women wear scarves, and then Niyah is his intention, so they're getting, just before they pray, they're getting themselves in the right frame of mind, right attitude, inner attitude. And there's the opening prayer, Allah Akbar, God is great. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Praise be to Allah, the cherisher, the sustainer of the worlds, the most gracious, the most merciful master of the day of judgment. Thee do we worship, and thine aid do we seek. Show us a straight way, Sharia. So the word Sharia just means the straight way. This is the way in which I should live my life in order to get to God. The way of those on whom thou hast bestowed thy grace, those whose portion is not wrath, and those who do not go astray. So that's the opening prayer. Again, it's all directed towards God. And then this is the way in which they pray. So these are called the rakas. So there's a cycle of standing and bowing and prostrating along with prayers that go with it. And the different numbers of rakas depending on which prayer it is during the day. And so it starts here on the right. And so like this, and say the first prayer, then go to the second part, then a half bow, then stand up, and then bend at both knees at the same time to prostrate themselves completely, and then sit back on their haunches with the feet, anyway, two different positions, and then might say dua or personal prayers. And then they'll finish in that position on the far left after they've done a series of these cycles of rakas by blessing fellow, two different understandings, turn to the left and then the right. And one understanding is to be blessing fellow Muslims on the left and on their right. And also another understanding is to be greeting the angels on the left, on the right. So I believe there's an angel on their left, an angel on the right. And the angel on the left writes down all the good things they do, and the angel on the right writes down all the bad things they do. Or maybe it's the other way around, I can't remember. And they just want to keep the angels happy. And also to remind themselves that actually everything they do is recorded. Yeah, and one is going to be judged on everything one does. So by praying 5 times a day then, quite regularly, Muslims are brought, they have to stop what they're doing and then go through this process, enter into the presence of God and say these prayers. So you say 5-10 minutes and then carry on with what they were doing in their work or their daily life. And so continually then taking a break, entering into the presence of God. And so through this, it's probably quite challenging. Suppose you're busy doing something which you really enjoy doing, then you have to think, what am I going to do? Or maybe I can skip this prayer. So all the time having to confront their fallen nature in that sense. All the time having to confront the lazy side. And all the time having to overcome that to say, no, I'm going to say my prayers now. So it's like a life of indemnity, like restoring and overcoming a fallen nature and re-establishing the relationship with God. The whole of Islam then is like a way of restoration, restoring myself. This way. So it's restoring the foundation of faith.
Yeah, I just want to share that one day I went back to Harrow, St. George Shopping Center, you know, the prime market, and I needed to go to, toilet, but that area was one Muslim gentleman with a hat and was facing the wall, sit on the floor and was praying.
Yes.
Everybody was looking, what is he doing, but bowing, like I don't know how many times, and everybody was just so what is he doing.
Yeah, and if you go in an aeroplane, especially Emirates or something, you'll find that at the back they're bowing and praying, and sometimes you're driving along the road, you see a coach load, the coach is pulled over into lay-by and people get out and they pray. And it's becoming more and more common. It's a real problem in many places because they just praying in the middle of the street and the whole road gets closed, and it's got another kind of imperialistic kind of feeling to it when they do it like that, disrupting the daily way of life of ordinary people who are not Muslims in a non-Muslim country. The big problem in Paris, it's a problem in some parts of London. And to be honest, I find it very disrespectful and very antisocial to do that, to disrupt the roads and traffic and everything. But
They are disrespectful.
Yes, I think so. Personally, I think so. Yes,
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful to pray, obviously, but then you shouldn't do it in a way which is going to cause inconvenience to ordinary people going around their daily business, closing down streets and all sorts of other things. Yeah. Anyway, so Friday prayers. So this will be in a mosque, and so this is usually on a Friday, late morning, that you'll find this sort of situation of lots of people. Because the reality is, there aren't enough mosques, and on a Friday, Muslims like to go to the mosque to pray. There aren't enough mosques, and the mosques themselves aren't big enough, and so they go to the mosque and they will pray on the pavements outside and the streets outside and the roads outside, and on a Friday. And this is it's really, it's a problem. And then after the Friday prayers in the mosque, there'll be a sermon. So you can see they're all lined up here, and they're all equal. Everyone's lined up. A rich person next to a poor person. Everybody's lined up in complete equality in front of God, which is a very beautiful thing. So this is the mosque. The word mosque itself just means a place of prostration, means a place to pray. It doesn't have to be a building. So the early mosques in Arabia, they were just some stones. You make a mosque by putting a row of stones, rocks in the sand, and you create a mosque, a place to pray, to prostrate oneself. So the mosque itself then is a prayer hall, which is what we saw in the previous picture. Huge prayer halls. Sometimes they're huge, sometimes they're quite small. And then within the prayer hall there's something called the minbar. So this is the pulpit. So you can see here in the bottom picture, you can see here there's a pulpit. And so on Friday prayers then, somebody who will lead the prayer, then often this person then will give a sermon from the pulpit about all sorts of different things, about spiritual life and about how they should live their life and this sort of thing. The person who leads the prayers, he's called an imam. He's not a priest. He doesn't have the same status within a Muslim community as a priest would have within the Christian community. He's just a person who leads the prayers. Any adult man can lead the prayers. But quite often a mosque will employ someone to do that and give the sermon and look after the mosque and do the teaching and all sorts of other things. But it's not a special position in that sense as being a priest is within the Catholic Church. So just leader of the prayer. Then within the mosque also there's the mihrab, which is on what's called the Qibla wall. So the mihrab is a semicircular niche in the wall. So again, you can see it here. Can you see this? Yeah? Mm-hmm. It's semicircular. And so this is called the Qibla wall. And so this here, this niche, it shows the direction of Mecca. Mm-hmm. And so when they all bow in the direction of Mecca. And so obviously, if the mosque is purpose-built, then it'll be right at the front. Mm-hmm. But some buildings have become mosques, and you'll find the mihrab in whatever place it is, and so sometimes they'll be lining up diagonally across the room, depending if it's if it's a building not built to be a mosque. And then there'll be a minaret. So you can see these towers here, they're minarets. And in the past, you'd have someone called a muezzin. He would climb up there and he'll call people to prayer. Nowadays they don't do that. Now they just have a loudspeaker, generally speaking, and of course it's incredibly noisy. So you've got this issue, for example, in Switzerland, where they decided, well, we don't want this. And so new mosques that are built in Switzerland are not allowed to have minarets, because they said it doesn't fit with our architecture. It's not an integral part of the mosque, in that sense. And also you have all sorts of issues about, well, how fair is it for a mosque to be calling people to prayer with a loudspeaker when a lot of the people living in the neighborhood aren't Christian? Aren't Muslims. They're Christians or not religious at all. So, should this be allowed? Is this not, antisocial? Noise abatement and all that sort of stuff. raises all kinds of issues. People feel it's offensive, it's, un-English or whatever, un-European. And, so Muslim fundamentalists regard it as a way of establishing a certain kind of hegemony over the neighborhood. And there's all kinds of, it's a lot of politics that goes along with these things, like praying in the streets, loudspeakers, minarets, which are higher than all other buildings in the neighborhood to assert their dominance. There's a lot of politics with architecture. There always is. And same with churches. The steeple is always the highest building. There's a lot of politics along with the architecture and these things. It's not just the spiritual stuff. And it's the politics which, comes out from time to time. Also, the mosque will have a dome. Generally speaking, you can see some domes over there. And then it's decorated with calligraphy. Not with paintings or pictures, especially not of human beings or anything like that. It's just the calligraphy. And Muslim calligraphy is extraordinarily beautiful, stunningly beautiful. There's Arabic. It's so amazing. And what they can do with their language. There's also, in the mosque, will be a place for washing, obviously, and an imam, who I mentioned, and also it's a place for education. So often there'll be a madrasa attached where Muslim children after school would then go to the mosque to learn Arabic, to memorize the Quran, and also learn other Muslim customs and traditions. So,
Word madrasa.
Madrasa.
This education.
It's madrasa. Well, it's like a Christian Sunday school. In that sense, it's like it's religious school.
Okay.
So it's a religious school where people will go there to study. But the study, generally speaking, is about learning to read and to memorize the Quran. It's completely different in that sense to the kind of study that a Muslim child would undergo, which is all about questioning and engaging in the conversation. And in a madrasa, it's mostly about a lot of it's about memorizing the Quran. Yeah, again, the different issues here. Okay, third pillar of Islam is called zakah. This is other word is like tithing or charity. So this is the idea of the purification of wealth by payment of an annual welfare due. So the word implies wholesomeness and blessing with a potential for growth and fruit. So here's the idea that, anyway, the practice is that Muslims would give 2.5% of their surplus income. So at the end of every year, they'd do the accounts, and 2.5% of everything that is surplus, that, after the year that's finished, they would find what's left over, 2.5%, and then they would take 2.5%, and that would be given then to charity. So the spiritual meaning behind this is a way of purifying one's wealth by making this annual welfare contribution. And so the word zakah in Arabic implies wholesomeness and blessing with potential for growth. So the idea that by giving, you're purifying everything that's left, and you're allowing God to bless what you kept, and then that will lead to growth and fruition, and you become more prosperous. So the idea is the more you give, the more prosperous you become. Yeah. And so it's a very joyful duty, a way of worshipping God, Allah. So it's a way of worshipping Allah. It's a way of giving something to God, and so Muslims regard it as something very joyful, a joyful duty to do, purifying themselves from greed, thinking, oh, I want to keep all this for myself, but actually just want to give it away. And from the other side, poor receive this as a right. There's this idea that one has a right to receive charity if one needs it. If one hasn't got enough to eat, or if one's a widow, or this, that, or the other, one has a right to be supported by the community. So this doesn't come through it's not a welfare state, because it doesn't come through the government. It comes through the religious community. And you would give this amount. And also supports Muslim unity and brotherhood, through which Muslims can support other Muslims, particularly who are less well off than themselves. It's part of the sort of economic system of redistribution. Fourth is Hajj. So it's a pilgrimage that Muslims are expected or encouraged to make once in their lifetime if they can afford it. So it's not compulsory. Only if they can afford it are they expected to go on pilgrimage, on Hajj. And one important condition is you can only do it if you first paid off all your debts. So it's not, you're not allowed to think, oh, I should go on Hajj, therefore I'm going to take out a bank loan, or I'm going to go and borrow money, I'm going to go into debt so I can go on pilgrimage. Actually, completely the opposite. You're not allowed to go on a Hajj or pilgrimage until you've cleared all your debts and you can afford it. So it shouldn't be something which makes you indebted, and it shouldn't be something that impoverishes your family, etc., etc. I think that's a good rule.
I think so.
Yeah, I think it's a rule that should also exist within our own spiritual community. It's kind of heartbreaking when some people, go off to Chongpyong and places when they're totally poverty-stricken and etc., and can't afford it. I think that's wrong, unethical. So for a Muslim then, only after when they can afford it, and so it's usually when they're older, they've taken care of all their children, etc., and retired. But sometimes people go, there's a family, if they can afford it, or with a husband and wife. So this Hajj then, by tradition, it always existed, in the sense, I said last week, the Kaaba was built by Abraham and Ishmael as a place for pilgrimage. And so there have always been pilgrimages going there. So this was re-established by Muhammad, but also reformed and purified, and a lot of the sort of pagan associations were got rid of when he destroyed all the pagan idols. Now it takes place between these particular days, the 8th and the 13th of the month of Dhul Hijjah. Muslims gather from all over the world, and they arrive, and then they put on ihram, go into a state of ihram, which means they put on a white seamless garment. So everybody is exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or you're, very poor. Everyone's wearing the same thing. Everyone in that sense is equal before God. So you can be going on Hajj, and it can be, someone who's a very humble person with someone who may be a king, and they're just all walking around together. There's no distinction. So again, it's a nice thing. The idea here, it represents the fact that in front of God everyone is the same. And by being white and seamless, it again represents living a pure lifestyle and purifying one's thoughts. And then when they arrive there, they recite a particular prayer, talbiyah. They say, here I am, God, I've arrived, here I am. Tell God, I just landed. And then the first part of the Hajj is the Umrah. And so they do something called Tawf. So they enter the sacred mosque. So this is the mosque here. I mean, it's huge. There's the Kaaba, a black building, originally by tradition built by Abraham and Ishmael, but many times rebuilt because earthquakes and need to be repaired. And then you can see, this is during Hajj, you can see the countless numbers of people who are standing there. They ordered. How do you think that happens? You can see they're all in concentric circles. How does it happen?
They probably have markers on the floor or something.
No. I think they just organise themselves. You're not given a sort of seat number or seat place or anything. People just flow in there and they just organise themselves into these things naturally, spontaneously. They know how to conduct themselves. There aren't, people pointing, you should go there, you should go there. So that's the sacred mosque. They enter the sacred mosque and they circle the Kaaba 7 times, anti-clockwise. And if they can, they kiss or they point to the black stone. So, anyway, in one of these corners, there's a black stone. And surrounding the black stone is this, I think it's silver, sort of shield around it. And the tradition is that this was the black stone that was put in by Muhammad, if you remember I told you last week, and may have been a meteorite. One tradition said it's Adam's gravestone or something. And so, if they can, they'll kiss it or they'll touch it, but you can imagine hardly anybody can do that. It's quite crowded, so they'll just point at it. And then they'll run or walk between the hills of Safa and Marwa. So again, the story in the Quran is after Hagar and Ishmael were kicked out by Abraham, well not kicked out, but sent away by Abraham, then they went into the desert and they couldn't find any water. And so Hagar, she ran between these two hills looking for water. And so what Muslims do on the Hajj is they're retracing the steps of Hagar and Ishmael in that sense. And so they run or walk between these two hills. And then eventually some angel Jibril revealed the location of some water, which is just where Ishmael was sitting and waiting, and that still dug, and that became a well. And so there's this Zamzam well, which has still produced water today. Some nice qualities about it, I can't remember what they are now. And they have a drink from this well, some water from this well, which never runs out. So there it is, the sacred mosque. And then after that, the first official day of the Hajj, they travel to Mina, where they spend the night in prayer. This is where they are. You can see there's just crowds and crowds of people. And then on the 9th day, Dhul Hijjah, then they...
What is Dhul Hijjah?
That's the name of the month. It's the month of Dhul Hijjah. So that's, we call our September, October, they have their own Arabic names for the months and their own. So this is, so here they gather before the Mount of Mercy on what's called the plain of Arafat, and they pray and they stand there all day long in the sun, and they pray a prayer of repentance all day, a bit like Jews do in similar, on Yom Kippur. Stand there and they pray all day. And so the tradition is that this is where, after the fall, Adam and Eve, according to the Quran, they wandered around, and eventually one day they met up and they were sorry about what had happened, and so they repented to God, and God forgave them. So Muslim tradition is that took place here on the Mount of Mercy. This is where God recognized Adam and Eve and forgave them their sin. And also this is the place where Muhammad preached his last sermon, which we looked at last week. And from there they travel to Muzdalifah, where they pray, and then they collect 49 pebbles and they have a rest in the open air. So the next day they go and they stone the devil. So you can see these large pillars. Over the years these have got much bigger than they used to be, large pillars, and they'll go and they'll throw stones at these pillars. So this stoning these pillars represents stoning Satan. And so here, this is based upon the tradition that when Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, then the devil came along and tried to tempt and persuade Abraham not to sacrifice his son. And so Abraham then rejected Satan's temptation. So to reenact that, Muslims, they'll throw these stones at these three pillars, symbolizing Satan.
Arafat is the name of a famous politician.
Arafat, yeah. Yes, the Palestinian leader.
Palestinian.
Anyway, so at the end of Hajj, the last day of Hajj, then there's a feast, is Eid ul-Adha, which was just the other day, a feast of sacrifice. And so here you can see in Afghanistan sacrificing a sheep. So it's all very messy. So this is again, all these things are connected to what happened in Genesis. It's like, as it says, rooted in the Abrahamic tradition. And so if you remember that when God told Abraham not to sacrifice his son, then Abraham found a ram in the thicket and sacrificed that instead. And so sacrificing a sheep represents remembering Abraham willing to make the supreme sacrifice. And the sacrifice of sheep or a goat or a camel. And at the same time, same day, all the men will shave their heads or trim their beards. And then afterwards they finished Hajj and they became called a Haji, or a woman would be called a Hajjah. And in terms of what happens to these sheep and things they've sacrificed, the huge numbers get sacrificed in Mecca, as you can imagine, huge numbers. You can't eat them all. And so this meat is prepared and then it's sent to Muslims in other parts of the world that are poor. And so so the idea here then is that everyone should have the opportunity to participate in this festival and this feast. Even if you can't afford to sacrifice your own sheep, you can still participate in this festival by eating some of the meat and by being given some of the meat that was sacrificed by a Muslim who's more wealthy in another part of the world. That make sense? So this idea is very much the sense of brotherhood and community and of sharing, and that's all. All these things then contribute towards building up the Muslim community. And then Sawm, this is fasting during the month of Ramadan. And again, this is an act of appreciating God's gifts. You don't eat from sunrise to sunset, wherever you are in the world. And then this particular month, it varies in terms of our calendar. It moves around, and it represents obedience and submission and worship to God, and also experiencing what it's like to be hungry. So even if you're a very wealthy and rich Muslim, you should also fast from sunrise to sunset for a whole month every year. And so you realize, gosh, this is how some people feel every day. And so, you feel, actually, I should have some compassion upon people. I'm only fasting for 1 month a year, but some people, this is how they feel every day. So I should have compassion upon them. Know what it's like to be hungry. And as I said, from dawn till dusk, no food, no water. Not easy, especially in when it's very hot, or in Britain when the days are very long in the summer. And again, it's like a condition of indemnity. So Muslims then are living a life of indemnity, fasting for 1 month every year, overcoming the physical body, having dominion over the physical body. So you can understand why and praying 5 times a day, doing charity. So you can see all this is like conditions of indemnity to restore the 3 blessings. And so it's one of the reasons for the incredible dynamism you find within the Islamic spiritual community, why Islam is growing so rapidly. Despite the activities of Muslim extremists, still a lot of people are still converting to Islam, despite all the strange stuff that's going on by some by extremists. And then at the end of Ramadan, there'll be another Eid, another feast, and to celebrate the end of the fast and to visit the graves of their ancestors, their relatives, and also give gifts to each other and to other people. Okay, so this then is, I talked about these 5 pillars being based upon the Quran, and the top of them is Ummah. So by observing these and practicing these 5 pillars, you can see how this creates a Muslim community, of praying together. Believing the same thing, which is relatively easy, but they pray together 5 times a day, at least once a week together. They fast all together 1 month a year. And again, there's a sense of community. They give charity to those who are not so well off. So all these things, and also go on Hajj. And on Hajj, pilgrimage, meet Muslims from every other part of the world, of every race, different races and different nationalities, etc., 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 backgrounds. So this develops this incredible sense of community and brotherhood, and which is, as I said, based upon these very practical 5 pillars of faith. Though it works. I love Islam, in that way. It's a very simple, very practical faith or way of life, really. Very simple, very practical, and very spiritual way of life. It hasn't got all the complexities that you have within traditional Christianity of, having to believe in the Trinity and all these sort of complicated things. And it's just very, Okay, it's 8:30. I better stop there and finish off next week.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a
David.
question. I heard a few months ago that Islam has as many movements, or as Christianity has different kinds of churches. Like your Pentecostal and all that kind of thing. I haven't heard any corroboration
Hmm.
of that, because usually you think of you've got your Sunnis, your
Mhm.
Shiites, and there's a movement in London near where George lives. It was quite a big one. I can't remember.
I am
Ahmadiyya.
Ahmadiyyan.
Ahmadiyya.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I just wondered if you know anything about it.
I don't know much about the Ahmadiyyans. Muslims themselves don't regard Ahmadiyyans as Muslims.
Yeah.
They regard them as heretics.
Well, we get that in Christianity too, don't we?
Yes. The Shia and Sunni don't regard each other in that way. They just don't get on for various reasons, historical reasons. Yeah, certainly within the Shia, there's lots of different branches of particularly, but also within Sunni, there are different schools of thought and different schools of law. And also there are many different cultural divisions between Muslims.
Yeah.
And so you find mosques in this country, for example, they're all, generally speaking, most of them are connected to a particular ethnic community. It will be Syrians or Bosnians or,
Yeah.
Algerians. They are ethnically connected to Pakistani Muslims, Bangladeshi Muslims. They would have their own, mosque.
Yeah.
So there are those divisions as well.
Yeah.
But basically, between the Shia and the Sunni, basically the beliefs are pretty much the same. The main difference is in terms of authority. We'll look at this next week, who should be in charge. There are a few differences of practices. So for example, in the Quran it says that when you bow down to pray, your forehead should touch the ground. Okay, so how do you interpret that? Well, the Sunnis say, well, just bowing and your forehead touches the floor of the mosque is fine. But the Shia say, no, that's not, it has to touch the ground. So they have little clay tablets. So when they're praying, they put this clay tablet on the ground, on the floor of the mosque, which may be wooden or whatever, and they'll touch their forehead to that. So there are these sort of really very minor kind of differences, also in terms of, the way the community is organized and this sorts of things. Basic beliefs are pretty much the same. It's not like the divisions, theological divisions that you get within Christianity.
And the Sufis?
Sufis are much more mystical. Again, there are Muslims who don't regard them as being good Muslims because they believe it's possible to have a personal encounter and become one with God. And so from time to time, Sufis have been executed because that's heretical to think that or believe that. Well, basically it's very much a mystical kind of tradition. And there's ones that, I can't recall, they do these dances, spinning round. Sufi, yeah. And the particular angle and through, going round and round. This is the way in which they have some kind of mystical or spiritual encounter. So that's that particular division. It's the Sufis, generally speaking, who do most of the missionary work, historically. Most people have become converted to Sufism.
What is classical Islam, classical Muslim?
Classical?
Sunni and Shiite?
I suppose Sunni, Shia are the biggest groups. The Sunni are by far the largest. Mm.
Are they more predominant in different nations?
Sorry?
Is one more present?
Well, I mean, the Shia are predominantly in Iran and Iraq and Syria. But then there are also some Shia sects. And the Ismailis, for example, you find those quite a few in East Africa. Then there's the Baha'i again, who grew out of Islam, but Muslims don't regard them as Muslims, so I consider heresy or something.
So next week, what do you think you'll be focusing on?
Look at Sharia, and then look at the history, how things are developed. So look at the different empires and things, and the split between the Sunni and the Shia. And then somebody asked me if we could look at the Muslim view of Jesus, which I can look at. I can produce some material for that, as well. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds
All right.
sounds good. Would someone like to offer a closing prayer that we can have some teas and stuff?